Welcome to Say More from Boston Globe Opinion. I'm Shirley Leung. I'm a huge believer in student journalists. I was once one myself many, many years ago. Campus newspapers are not just a way to train our next generation of reporters and editors. They also provide great real-time reporting about what's going on in the hearts and minds of young people. In recent weeks, there's been a renewed surge in protests, both pro-Palestinian and pro-Israel. The one you're hearing now was earlier this month outside the Israeli consulate in Boston, recorded by the Globe's video team. These protests are some of the most controversial stories happening on college campuses over the past year. There have been charges of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, suspensions and expulsions, and a lot of journalistic gray area. I'm joined today by three student journalists who've been covering the conflict on campus. Eli Kerwin is the previous editor of Northeastern's newspaper, The Huntington News. Hannah Nguyen is the editor of Emerson's paper, The Berkeley Beacon. And Azusa Lippitt is a reporter at the Harvard Crimson. Welcome to Say More.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I also want to say we're recording in a podcast studio on the Boston University campus, and there's a class happening on the other side of the wall. Hopefully the sound won't be too loud. Okay, let's get into it. Harvard, Emerson, and Northeastern each found themselves in the news at different points this past year. I thought we could start with each of you telling us briefly about the unrest you saw on campus and in what capacity you covered it as a journalist.
So about a week after October 7th, we saw the beginning of a long slew of protests that would take place at Northeastern's campus. Those took place until about winter break, at which point, when students returned back to Northeastern's campus, it was much calmer, not as many protests took place. But then, in April, among several national encampments on college campuses, several Northeastern students built an encampment in our main quad on campus, and 48 hours later, the university oversaw their arrests.
Wow. I think that made the front page news of the New York Times, right?
Yeah, I believe so, yeah.
Back then. And Hannah, what did you see?
So, like Northeastern, at Emerson, protests began in October of last year, and then they kind of continued throughout the rest of that semester into the spring. And then in March, during President Jay Bernhardt's inauguration ceremony, there were multiple students protesting outside of the Cutler Majestic Theater where the inauguration was held. And as a result of that protest, 13 students, 12 of them being Emerson students, were arrested by Emerson College police. And then just a month later in April, on the 25th, students were arrested after 5 days of having their encampment in the Boylston Place alleyway.
And Azusa, at Harvard, were there arrests at Harvard?
There were not, actually. Just to echo my colleagues, there was a flurry of protest activity over the last academic year, culminating in a 20-day-long encampment in April and May of this year, but it ended relatively peacefully. The only consequences for the participants in the encampment was a series of suspensions that were later revoked over the summer.
And I seem to recall, both Northeastern and Emerson, you guys are, in the city, and I think at Harvard, there's like a Harvard Yard. So you guys, I think the administration had an opportunity to kind of seal everybody in, right? And I guess that's why there weren't really arrests, right?
Exactly. For the extent of the encampment and leading up to the university's commencement graduation ceremony, the Harvard Yard campus area was completely closed. Only university ID holders had access. So it was very exciting to be one of the only journalists able to enter the area at the time.
So Azusa, what are you seeing this year? I mean, we just had the first year anniversary of the October 7th, in the beginning of the Israeli-Hamas war.
I think other student journalists might resonate with this in that our administration had a lot of time over the summer to revise campus use policies, campus regulations, and essentially prepare as best they could for any way to prevent a similar year to last year. There have been couple of relatively peaceful protest actions that were relatively harshly acted upon by the administration, and it seems to have quieted the protesters. We have not had a large-scale disruptive protest yet this year.
Mm-hmm. And Hannah, what about you? What are you seeing at Emerson?
So right after the arrest in April, there were faculty and staff meetings about whether or not they wanted to vote no confidence for the president. And then during the summer, Emerson announced that the college was experiencing an enrollment shortfall. So we don't have the numbers yet, but essentially it moved our admissions rate to more than 50%. But in result of the enrollment shortfall, they also ended 2 programs, the Bright Lights film series, and they also ended the engagement lab. They do documentaries and other types of reporting. And then they also laid off 10 staff members.
Emerson, the layoffs or the budget cuts, I mean, was that any way related to what was going on with the protests or how the administration handled the protests?
Yeah. So the college said that they attributed the enrollment shortfall to negative media coverage and the campus arrest. They said that, students were turned away from attending Emerson just because they didn't want to go to a school that had protests. Emerson did not look too well in the media with 2 arrests in just 1 semester under a president who was only there for less than a year. It just wasn't a good look.
Did that surprise you that we had an effect on enrollment?
No, because there were multiple students who reached out to me saying, I'm interested in coming to Emerson, but I want to know what the environment is like. There were some students who were a part of the paper or a part of my classes who transferred out and went to different schools because some of them were dissatisfied with the administration for how they handled the protests.
Eli, what are you seeing?
At Northeastern, we saw something very similar to Harvard, that over the summer, the university implemented several policies that made it much more difficult for students who protest to get away with it, right? Where if someone is caught in violation of the Code of Student Conduct, they won't receive a degree, which I know similar things happen at other universities, but there was nothing in Northeastern's Code of Student Conduct that mentioned that. In addition to these policies, we're seeing not as escalatory protests or demonstrations, but we're seeing things that can escalate. A few weeks ago, there's been tabling, there's been art displays that students have built within campus property. And a few nights after October 7th, a student-organized protest off campus property took place where pro-Palestinian students marched around the Christian Science Center, which is very close to campus, but not on campus property.
I mean, Azusa and Hannah, what I found troubling at Harvard and Emerson is that some of the rhetoric sounds pretty militant. I think at Harvard, one of the Palestinian groups, they had a statement about now is the time to escalate. And I think at Emerson, it's like glory to the martyrs. I mean, that kind of rhetoric. I mean, are you worried that while demonstrations are peaceful now, that something more violent might come to pass later?
There's certainly always a chance at Harvard that further escalations will take place this semester. So far, though, it seems that the activism groups, largely I assume due to the stricter policies that administration imposed over the summer, have been acting as anonymously as they can. So either posting statements on social media that are just attributed to groups, or, for example, the night of October 7th, in fact, early on the morning of October 8th, the anniversary of Hamas's attack on Israel, there was a university administration building vandalized anonymously. Videos were posted on social media of people spray painting with red paint the John Harvard statue and breaking several windows of this building where large-scale, high-level administrative meetings take place, University Hall in the center of Harvard Yard. And the student groups that staged the encampment and are issuing these statements denied involvement in this act of vandalism. So you'll kind of see, on one hand, a potential escalation, but also the student groups distancing themselves from that action.
So there's been a lot of coverage of the protests on campus, whether it's the Boston Globe or New York Times, or you've probably seen AP running around, right? And so what do you think is missing from the coverage? I mean, you guys are student journalists covering it. You're seeing how we are covering it in the mainstream media. So, Eli, what do you think is missing? And what are some of the biggest misconceptions of the coverage of the campus protests?
I think there's a few things that we see. I think national coverage often lacks the institutional context that the protests take place in, right? At Northeastern specifically, we know students go on co-op with several companies that do business with Israel. And that was a large part of what the protesters were demanding stop, that this specific Northeastern thing stops taking place, right? And that kind of gets lost when national coverage comes in and paints it among a slew of other protests. It's much less specific. I think another aspect, especially of being a student journalist, that makes our coverage more difficult to navigate, but also a bit more impactful, is that we're students. We go to classes with the people who are protesting, the counter-protesters, the faculty that post online their thoughts on the protests, right? And because of that, our coverage itself needs to have both an empathetic lens, but also we need to be understanding of the fact that these are students. They're here to learn. They're here to voice their opinions and to be in positions where they have to be uncomfortable, because that's what learning is about. And I think that often in the national coverage, we're seeing students arrested, students protesting, but we're not seeing why they're protesting, how that fits into the greater context of the university itself.
For myself as a student, rather than just as a student journalist, I wish there were more attention to the need for students to grapple with these issues from morning to night, every day on campus, and the way that they do so very successfully and peacefully with each other. I think that our campuses, especially Harvard's, have been painted as places of hatred, tension, and issues, problems, political tensions that are impossible to reconcile. But I've watched my peers who have deeply different issues reconcile those problems in classrooms, dining halls, and just completely look past them on several moments. And I think there are these moments where the large majority of the student body does not want to think about these issues and just wants to coexist peacefully.
Yeah, if you read the coverage in the Globe or the Times, it does seem like it's chaos all the time. But that's really interesting that it's a little more. There's a little more peace and a little more understanding than perhaps is portrayed in the mainstream media. What about you, Hannah?
When I was reading a lot of the coverage of our protests, what I found interesting was that not a lot of people understood Emerson's culture, really. There were a lot of questions as to how did these encampments even happen? Why did they even come up? Like, this is so not Emerson. But it really is Emerson, right? Protests are deep-rooted in Emerson's culture. We've had so many protests way beyond this, unrelated to what's happening in the Middle East. There were protests, in response to the murder of George Floyd and how Emerson was talking about race, being a predominantly white institution. Even disruptive protests, too. There was a protest a few years ago where students went into one of the theaters at Emerson to disrupt the faculty assembly meeting, to call attention towards, what was happening outside of Emerson and to have Emerson recognize those things. So protests aren't new to Emerson at all. I wasn't surprised that the encampment happened. Certainly everything was very new to me. The level, I guess the arrests that happened, all of that was surprising. But the fact that the protests even happened in general, that's not a new thing at all. That's very much Emerson. And I think that's even what administration kind of forgot about too, of this is part of our culture. This is nothing new here.
So this regional war has rocked newsrooms all over the country, not just student papers. And a lot of journalists and editors have their own connections to the conflict, and that affects their perspective, and which I think is normal, but can make things challenging to be quote unquote objective, right? And so, Eli, I know you have family connections in Israel. So how has that affected your experience covering the conflict on campus?
An objective piece of news can be written by anyone. It's about the people you talk to, the process you take. So if you're getting the story, anyone can get a story right. And it's about the methodical reporting, the sourcing you have. All of that can be done by anyone. And so regardless of my personal beliefs or my personal background, anyone can write a story the same way that I would. But I think that having family in the region has also given me the perspective of deep empathy for everyone that I'm speaking to or everyone that we're reporting on. I have family in Israel, and as a result, this is an issue that's incredibly emotional to me simply because of my family's proximity to what's going on. And because of that proximity, I'm able to put myself in the shoes of any protester, any demonstrator, and understand how they must be feeling and speak to them and ask them questions with that empathy that's because of my family, not in spite of it.
What stands out to me is that over the past year, my peers who also report on the college and I have had the opportunity to attend a whole range of ideological events based in, again, just all across the political spectrum. And I think that is really what bolsters our objectivity, is that you're covering the encampment for 20 days and interspersed you're covering vigils hosted at Harvard Hillel, or you're going to a talk hosted by prominent professors who research anti-Semitism. And I think day in and day out, you get to build all the different aspects of your understanding of the issue on campus and see as many perspectives as there are. And I think that's been probably the most valuable part of the experience for me.
More of my conversation with a roundtable of student journalists after a short break. So some people would say there is a free speech crisis happening on university campuses right now, and ranging all the way from administration to students, and you may get fired or doxxed or having the wrong opinions. Azusa, I know this has been a real issue at Harvard. I think there was a recent survey, right, that indicated that close to half of professors and students are afraid to express their views on campus, fearing discrimination and backlash on social media. So were you surprised by these findings?
I think these survey findings are definitely telling of a quiet majority that exists. I think the perception is that Harvard is largely liberal, but I think there are many students who fall in the center who probably are hesitant to share those opinions. The most pertinent free speech issue that has come up so far this academic year that we've reported on at the Crimson has been a study-in protest at one of the main libraries on campus, Widener Library. Student protesters wore shirts with slogans like Free Palestine and just pro-Palestinian language, and they wore keffiyehs and they put stickers with pro-Palestine logos and symbols on their laptops, and they entered the library and studied for an hour. Administrators were there even before they entered the library, took down ID numbers based on what students had on their shirts and on their laptops. This caused a huge backlash in the name of freedom of expression. Our own editorial board at the Crimson has asked, what exactly it takes to be disciplined for studying in a library with political symbols on your laptop, your shirt. What exactly designates a protest and what can lead to discipline for doing so? Since the study-in, the students who participated have been banned from the library for 2 weeks since the study-in. At this point, if we're banning students from campus libraries, I think there is definitely an issue of freedom of expression.
It does sound draconian. right?
Yes.
Eli, you had mentioned earlier at Northeastern there were new protest policies put in place in recent months. So has that had an impact on free speech on campus?
So I think due to the fact that we haven't seen as many protests or demonstrations take place, there's only been a handful, it's hard to say whether or not these new policies will have a chilling effect or significantly damper students' ability to express themselves. But we do know that the policies reflect a lot of the demonstrations that took place last year. One of the policies is no affixing images or imagery on university property that relates to a demonstration. And we saw this at Northeastern throughout the year. There were flyers with the names of killed Palestinians taped on buildings. There were painted handprints pasted on to the sidewalk of one of the commons. And the thing is, because those things haven't happened this year, we don't know what the university's response is going to be if it does. So it's hard to say at the moment the effect that these policies will have on demonstrations, but they are definitely a response to the types of demonstrations we saw last year.
Mm-hmm. And Hannah, what about at Emerson? Is freedom of speech an issue?
Yeah, so during the summer, like at Northeastern and Harvard, Emerson also reviewed its student code of conduct and released an interim policy on campus demonstrations to kind of prepare for the fall semester. And in the interim policy, it says it outlines the locations where students aren't allowed to protest, the Boylston Place alleyway, and also the sidewalk in front of Emerson. Emerson doesn't really have a real campus. The campus is the city, but students aren't allowed to protest outside of Emerson. And they gave a list of locations inside the buildings where students can protest. But in order to do that, you have to register for that. So it takes a long time. Obviously, protests are meant to disrupt. So that's been incredibly difficult. Students can get in trouble protesting anywhere. And at the same time, I guess in regards to free speech, I can feel it certainly as a student reporter. Mm-hmm. Although we've gained a lot of trust of students in faculty and staff from last semester, because of these policies and all the risks that are out there of, getting suspended and being prohibited to be on campus, students are worried to talk to us. Students who are pro-Palestinian, students who are pro-Israel, that also includes faculty and staff. I went to a faculty assembly and there were faculty members expressing, I don't want the things I'm going to say to be printed. And I understand that. Students, they're just scared to talk. Actually, everyone at Emerson is scared to talk because they don't know what they're going to risk, either with the administration or just being ostracized by people on campus.
Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering how your experiences as student journalists have affected your own goals of becoming, journalists after school. And I mean, I was wondering, do you want to pursue this career, or you're like, oh no, I've seen enough. This is not for me. Azusa, why don't you start?
I think journalism has never been a career goal for me, actually, and I'm unsure whether it will be, but I think for now, this year has shown me how much purpose and fulfillment you can derive from doing student journalism, and I think I definitely want to work on my student paper as much as I can before graduation.
What about you, Hannah?
I mean, coming into Emerson, I knew I wanted to be a journalist. I was also a student journalist in high school, and I was so burnt out by the end of the semester, but the experience made me more excited to just get out there to report. I'm graduating in December, and I'm so excited about that because I know that there's more opportunities out there for me. And given my experience being a student journalist, I know how to approach, future events like this as a professional journalist. So I'm excited.
Yeah, I think that this experience was one of the most fulfilling I've ever had in anything I've ever done. And it's definitely, it's taught me a lot. It showed me how close a group of student reporters can truly get. The community that we built reporting over the course of the year, but also those 48 hours was nothing like I'd ever seen before. And I think for the future, I think, as both of you have said, it really does show the purpose of being a journalist, informing your community, holding institutions and organizations accountable. And I'm not 100% sure whether or not that this is locked in journalism as a future career path for me, but I think it definitely has shown me the importance of it and what can really come of it.
Last year, I interviewed Palestinian-American scholar Rashid Khalidi, and he was telling student protesters that similar to Vietnam War protesters, time would bear out that they were on the right side of history. Whether or not you agree with him, is that something you think about, how history will see these protests and how your stories will be read in the future?
Absolutely. I think one of the most common chants we hear at a protest is Harvard University, we know which side you're on, remember South Africa, remember Vietnam. And that chant comes up at nearly every pro-Palestine action that we cover. I think it totally harkens back to these historical moments that we read through when we're working on our coverage as well. We see the last time there was an encampment. We see the last time there were administrative buildings occupied by protesters. And we definitely think about that. At the same time, at a vigil held on October 7th that I covered that was organized by Harvard Hillel, there were speeches made saying we are on the right side of history, stand with the victims of Hamas's October 7th attack. That is the right side of history. So I think this term is definitely being used on both sides.
Emerson is a communication and art school, so anyone who's involved in any of this, they're the ones, creating films in the future. They're the ones, they're the journalists in the future. They have a lot to say about, what the future is going to look like and the types of discussions that we're going to be having. So people are looking at Emerson because they're kind of launching those people into those careers, and they're shifting, how we think about things, how we discuss things, and what we prioritize.
Similarly, at Northeastern, we see this type of marketing that advertises the students as global, experiential scholars, where they're going out into the world and learning. And I think that this is just another example of that, right? We know that over 42,000 people have been killed by Israel in Gaza, and we know that more than half of all homes have been destroyed. And to protest in defense of those people is admirable. And I think that anyone can look at protesters and understand why they believe they're on the right side of history. And whether or not that's the case, that's not a student newspaper's determination to make. But I think that by amplifying the voices of pro-Palestinian protesters or people that attend vigils in remembrance of the people that died due to Hamas's attack, I think that by simply uplifting those voices, we are fulfilling a responsibility that would otherwise not be fulfilled.
Eli Kerwin is a reporter at the Huntington News at Northeastern. Hannah Nguyen is the editor of the Berkeley Beacon. And Azusa Lippitt is a reporter at the Harvard Crimson. Thank you all for talking to me, and you're giving me hope about the future of journalism.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Say More is a production of the Boston Globe. Today's episode was produced by Anna Kusmer and Mara Melitz. Our editor is Jim Dow. Our engineer is Uzair Ahmed. Our music is from APM Music. If you like the show, please follow us and leave us a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email us at saymore@globe.com. I'm Shirley Leung. Thanks for listening.